Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. The big story in aviation, of course, Qatar Airways announcing a 25% equity investment in partnership with Southern African airline Airlink. This was revealed at a signing ceremony in Doha. Now, Qatar Airways will appoint 2 members to Airlink's board of directors. Let's make sense of this development with our aviation expert, Desmond Latham, who joins us now via our video link. And Desmond, it's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for speaking to the SABC News channel. You know, both parties will have us believe that this is great for their own growth prospects. But what do you reckon will be the net impact on travellers?
Well, hello, Ayanda. Thanks for having me, and hello to all the viewers. Well, I mean, it's very exciting in one sense, but also another. It's a case in point about North African airlines, particularly Emirates and Qatar, who've been hunting African-based operations to purchase for some time now. At one stage, I don't know if we're aware of this, but Emirates was looking at buying into SAA when it ran into problems a few years back. So the prospect for Southern African passengers is excellent. I mean, there's more opportunities. At the same time, Airlink has had a relationship with Qatar for some time. They've had a code-share agreement where tickets have been swapped, for example. So they've been flying into Southern Africa through Airlink for some time. So it just formalizes that relationship. But it is good news, clearly, that there's the growth of aviation links around the world through Qatar for Southern African airline.
Right. We'll speak about this perception of some kind of scramble for Africa in a moment, because I've heard that kind of emerge in people making sense of this development. But for those who have, let's call it a pedestrian understanding of these things, how different is this particular collaboration or partnership from what we saw between Gulula and British Airways, for example, a couple of years back?
It's a good question, and virtually nothing. I mean, the big thing there was that you could fly through British Airways and their relationship with Comair around the world. And the same thing applies and has been applying through Airlink for South Africa. So it's very similar to that arrangement. And that arrangement is standard throughout aviation in the world. I mean, in South Africa, it's had a long, going back to the 40s, of flying around the world and having links to world aviation. And for a period, SAA, for example, had a code-share with Delta. I used that from the 1980s until SAA basically faced bankruptcy, where you could fly through Delta Airlines. So you'd fly into America on SAA, then fly into other American cities using Delta, as an example. So this is a standard situation. Now, right. Referring to the scramble, you mentioned the scramble for African airlines. I think it's, Africa's got a very young population. I think the average age is under 27, generally across the continent. We're a growing continent, and therefore, people with a long-term idea of business growth are targeting Africa for that, because our middle class is growing. So clearly, if you're in the business of medium-term growth, 10, 15 years, this is where you're looking.
Right, and that's exactly where I was going next. What's in it for Qatar? And I suppose you've already answered that. They're clearly playing the long-term game here. But my understanding is also that the country's laws doesn't allow a foreign company, let's call it, to have a stake larger than 25% in any case.
That's correct. I mean, the bottom line is strategic. You don't want, I believe that this is a necessary thing, and it's, this goes back for generations in Southern African terms. You don't want an outsider running your airlines for you. You really don't. I mean, you want some kind of, it's a strategic, scientific-based enterprise. You can imagine people who are your enemy suddenly flying airplanes over your country. It's a bit of a problem. So you need to, I do believe this, and I sit at odds with members of the aviation fraternity who think that should change, or else there won't be investment in aviation. Well, I mean, this is investment in aviation, so that blows up that argument, I must say to you, that it's strategic. We need to control, as nationals, our own airspace, as we do our own airwaves. You can't license yourself as SABC unless you do it through a CASA, for example, which the Department of Communication runs indirectly. So you get the picture here. So I do think that we have to take that into account. But we do want to allow a situation to develop where controlling ownership of buyers is not government. I mean, you do need to have a situation develop where you allow that. And we do at the moment with our private airlines, Airlink, Lyft, FlySatway, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you describe the kind of relationship that the country has with these Middle Eastern companies? I mean, as you said, Qatar and Emirates, dominant players in the market itself. But, this is kind of a unique partnership, so to speak, at least insofar as collaborating between a Southern African country and a country in the Middle East?
Well, that's a good question, because Lanseria, for example, is owned by a Middle Eastern company. So,
wow.
I mean, as we say simultaneously that there's an opportunity in aviation, there's also opportunities for international people to come in and on the logistics side and work in tandem with local companies. So the relationship has at times been fractious, because Qatar, for example, and Emirates are indirectly, they deny this, but they are indirectly subsidized by the state, whereas SAA is subsidized by the government to some extent through the taxpayer, but not directly. So Qatar and Emirates, the way they operate in their own countries, in UAE for Emirates and Qatar Airlines for Qatar, is that they do have direct state interference in the business, and they've just been allowed to do that because of where they sit in the world. They entrepose. They center to the east-west flights, which in aviation make the most money. So flights from India fly via Dubai and then onwards to America and Europe, for example. We don't live in that zone. We live far south, so we have a challenge. So, I mean, those airlines are loved and hated, I suppose you could say. They're loved by the passengers, but they're hated by other airlines because they have a sort of false economy that has developed. And I'll get in some trouble for saying that, but if you look at the ownership structure inside Qatar and Emirates, they have a bias towards and from within their own state that has upended world travel. To the advantage for you and I, if we want a cheap flight to, say, New York if you want to do a 24-hour flight to New York via Dubai. But I have to say that it has created consternation in aviation circles and for other countries.
Speaking about that consternation, I mean, there's already commentary around this moving us further away from having a more competitive market than we'd like. And I wonder how much credence you reckon there is to that perception.
I mean, there's twofold thing here, Ayanda. It is true that these massive airlines have a hold to some extent on the concept of low cost and premium flying around the world, but they also offer services, and these services are good. So at the same time, you can say that for local airlines, they are both an opportunity and a threat. If you do your SWOT analysis on aviation, you can see that for Airlink, it's an opportunity. They've firmed up a sale of 25%, which is by law all they can do. But all they've really done internally is they've floated shares that have been in existence. And so nothing much really changes there, just firms up the relationship. But when it comes to Southern African airlines, what we've said for a long time is that regional growth is going to grow our airlines over the long term. In other words, flying from here to the DRC, or from here to Nairobi, here to Ghana, and vice versa. That's, African growth in aviation is definitely a big thing. The big problem we have is post-colonialism, where a lot of these states have a national ethic that is, they regard aviation as the goose that lays the golden egg. And unfortunately, many of them have killed the goose over the years. They've added tariffs, which are off the charts. And I'm afraid South Africa is part and parcel of that. Some of our tariffs, our landing fees, for example, are the highest in the world. And we sit here at the bottom end of Africa. We should really be looking at sharpening our pencils when it comes to some of these things to make ourselves work more harmoniously regionally within SADC, for example, and with ECOWAS and the other regional bodies, and to drop some of these post-colonial big man syndrome operations, which operate through nation statism it's counter to the business logic of you and I want to fly to Harare and back at the best flight in the quickest time, or to Mauritius, and so on and so on. So that's really the argument here.
Fascinating. So not everything is as it seems, I suppose, is the lesson, as usual. Desmond Latham, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Appreciate the time. Desmond speaking to us there as an aviation commentator.